Hey guys, tonight we step back over 1,000 years into a world so ruthlessly practical, so unapologetically savage, that nearly everything these people considered normal would land someone in prison today, or at least therapy. We are diving deep into the shocking, strange, and sometimes stomach-churning everyday realities of the Vikings. The year is 893 CE. The place is Kaupang, a bustling trading settlement nestled along the western shore of the Oslo Fjord in what is now southern Norway. The morning air bites at your exposed skin with the kind of cold that feels personal, almost vindictive. You smell the place before you truly see it, a thick tapestry of scents weaving together, wood smoke curling from a dozen longhouses, the iron tang of blood drifting from the slaughter pens, fermenting fish that has been buried for months in the earth, and beneath it all, the salt-kissed breath of the fjord itself. Seagulls scream overhead like they are perpetually outraged about something, which, fair enough, this is Scandinavia. The settlement sprawls before you in organised chaos. Wooden structures with turf roofs that look like the earth itself decided to grow buildings, merchants hollering prices in Old Norse that sounds like someone gargling gravel, and everywhere, absolutely everywhere, people engaged in activities that would make a modern human resources department spontaneously combust. A group of children sprints past you, laughing, and you notice one of them is carrying what appears to be a human jawbone, just casually, like a toy. Nobody bats an eye. A woman nearby is calmly grinding grain while discussing with her neighbour the best methods for exposing an unwanted infant to the elements. They debate whether the forest or the shoreline yields faster results, as if comparing recipes for bread. Two men stand near a wooden post, examining a young woman with the detached assessment of someone buying livestock at auction. She is a thrall, a slave, and her sale is as unremarkable here as purchasing groceries. Welcome to the Viking Age. You probably will not survive this. Actually, let me rephrase that. You definitely will not survive this with your modern sensibilities intact. Everything you think you know about basic human decency, about rights and dignity and the sanctity of life is about to get thrown into the North Sea. The Vikings were not cartoon villains twirling moustaches and cackling about evil. They were pragmatic people living in a brutal environment where survival demanded brutal solutions. What shocks us was simply Tuesday for them. Normal, expected, even celebrated. Before we sail further into these icy waters, do me a favour. If you are new here, smash that subscribe button like a Viking smashing a monastery door. Turn on notifications so you never miss another journey through history's strangest chapters, and drop a like on this video. Consider it your offering to the algorithm gods, far less demanding than the Old Norse ones, I promise. The longship is loaded, the oars are ready, and the saga is about to begin. Now, as you stand in Kaupang on this crisp autumn morning in 893, you need to understand something fundamental about the world you've entered. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from the late 8th century to the late 11th century, was not merely a period of raiding and pillaging, though there was plenty of that. It was an entire civilization with its own complex legal codes, religious practices, social hierarchies and cultural norms. And those norms, from a modern perspective, read like a catalogue of horrors. You watch a merchant nearby completing a transaction. He's trading a young Irish boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, captured during a raid on the eastern coast of that green island. The buyer examines the child's teeth, checks his limbs for defects, and haggles over the price with the same energy your neighbour might use at a farmer's market arguing about the cost of heirloom tomatoes. The boy stares ahead with hollow eyes, and you realise with a sinking feeling that this scene is replicated dozens of times daily in settlements across Scandinavia. This is the thrall trade, and it is as integral to the Viking economy as shipbuilding or farming, but we'll get deeper into thrall soon enough. For now, you are still orienting yourself, still trying to process the sheer foreignness of everything around you despite the familiar human forms going about their business. A commotion draws your attention toward the water's edge. A longship has arrived, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the morning mist like a blade through flesh. Warriors disembark and the crowd parts for them with a mixture of respect and something else, something closer to fear. These men move differently than the merchants and craftsmen. Their eyes have a quality you cannot quite name, a distance, an absence. One of them wears a wolf pelt draped over his shoulders, and his teeth, when he smiles at a greeting, appear to have been deliberately filed into points. He is a berserker, you will later learn, and the things he does before battle would be classified as severe mental illness in your time. Here, he is honoured, celebrated. Parents point him out to their children as an example to admire. You pass by a longhouse where a legal proceeding of some kind is taking place. A crowd has gathered around two men who stand facing each other with barely contained hostility. An older man with an impressive beard, because of course everyone here has an impressive beard, appears to be officiating. You catch fragments of the dispute. Something about an insult, a cow, a question of honour. The resolution being proposed is not arbitration or compensation, but holmgang, a formal duel to the death. Both parties seem to consider this a perfectly reasonable way to settle the matter of a cow and some harsh words. Nobody in the crowd looks disturbed by this. A few are already placing bets. The legal system you are witnessing is intricate, surprisingly sophisticated in some ways, and absolutely bonkers in others. The Vikings had law codes, assemblies called things where disputes were heard and judgments rendered, and detailed procedures for everything from property disputes to accusations of witchcraft. But the punishments sanctioned by these laws and the practices they permitted belong to a different moral universe entirely. You wander deeper into the settlement, passing workshops where skilled craftsmen forge the iconic swords and axes that will become symbols of Viking terror across Europe. The metalwork is genuinely impressive. These people may have been brutal, but they were not primitive. Their ships were engineering marvels, their navigation techniques centuries ahead of other Europeans, their artistic traditions sophisticated and beautiful. The same hands that created intricate silver jewellery and carved elaborate runestones also performed acts that would haunt your dreams if you witnessed them. Near the centre of the settlement stands a large wooden structure, bigger than the surrounding longhouses. This is a hov, a temple space dedicated to the worship of the Norse gods. Odin, the one-eyed all-father who traded his eye for wisdom and hung himself from the world tree for knowledge of the runes. Thor, the thunder god whose hammer protected humanity from the giants. Freya, the goddess of love and war and death, who claimed half of all warriors slain in battle for her own hall. The worship of these gods requires blood, not metaphorical blood, not symbolic blood, but actual, literal, still warm blood. The festival called Blot, which translates roughly to sacrifice, involved the ritual slaughter of animals and on special occasions humans. You will witness one before our journey ends. You will wish you had not. A woman passes you carrying a newborn wrapped in rough cloth. She looks tired, as new mothers do in any era, but there is an anxiety in her expression that goes beyond normal new parent exhaustion. She's headed toward the household of the settlement's chieftain, you realise, and then you understand. The child has not yet been named. In Viking society, an infant was not considered fully human, not granted the protection of law or community until the naming ceremony. Before that ceremony, typically held 9 days after birth, the child could be legally exposed, left outside to die from cold, from predators, from simple neglect. If the baby was deemed too weak, if the family could not afford another mouth, if the father simply decided he did not want this particular child, exposure was the accepted solution. The woman's anxiety makes terrible sense now. She is taking her baby to be judged. You find yourself needing to sit down. The culture shock is physical, almost nauseating. And yet, as you watch the people of Kopan go about their morning, you cannot help but notice how normal it all seems to them. Children play, couples argue, merchants cheat each other with practiced ease. Old men complain about the younger generation. Some things truly are universal. These are not monsters. They are humans operating within a moral framework so different from yours that it might as well be an alien civilization. The thing about the Vikings that modern popular culture often gets wrong is the nature of their brutality. Movies and television shows tend to portray them as either noble savages, wise and spiritual beneath a thin veneer of violence, or as one-dimensional psychopaths who killed for the sheer joy of it. The reality is far more unsettling. The Vikings were neither noble nor psychopathic. They were practical. Terrifyingly, systematically, coldly practical. Every shocking practice you will encounter on this journey served a function within their society. Thrall keeping provided essential labour. Infant exposure controlled population and resources. Blood feuds maintained a form of social order in the absence of centralised authority. Human sacrifice ensured the favour of gods who controlled the harvests and the seas. Hulmang prevented disputes from spiralling into destructive conflicts. This does not make any of it okay. It does not excuse or justify the suffering inflicted. But it does help explain how ordinary people who loved their families, who created art, who told stories and jokes and worried about the future, could participate in practices that seem monstrous to us. They were not evil. They were products of their time, their environment, their belief systems, just as we are products of ours. And if that thought makes you slightly uncomfortable, if it makes you wonder what practices of our own age might horrify people 1,000 years from now, well, that discomfort is worth sitting with for a moment. The sun climbs higher over Kaupang, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the settlement. Ships bob at anchor in the fjord. Smoke rises from forges and cooking fires. The sounds of commerce and conversation and occasional violence blend into the background hum of a living community. You take a deep breath of that complicated, pungent air, and you prepare yourself for what comes next. Because we are about to go deeper, we are going to examine each of these shocking normalcies in detail, starting with the institution that perhaps defined Viking society more than any other single practice. We are going to talk about thralls, the human beings bought, sold, bred and discarded like livestock across 3 continents. The Viking slave trade was one of the largest and most sophisticated operations of its kind in history, and its scale would surprise even those who think they know this era. The merchant you watched earlier, the one selling the Irish boy, he was a small-time operator. The real players in this game dealt in hundreds, sometimes thousands of human lives. They had established routes stretching from the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire, from the frozen north to the blazing markets of Baghdad, and every single person in this settlement either owned a thrall, had been a thrall, or knew exactly how the system worked. You follow the merchant and his newly purchased Irish boy through the winding paths of Kaupang, keeping enough distance to avoid suspicion, but close enough to observe. The transaction you witnessed was merely the retail end of something far larger, a vast network of human trafficking that stretched across the known world and represented one of the most valuable commodities in the entire Viking economy. The boy stumbles slightly, his leg still unsteady from weeks aboard a ship, and the merchant yanks his arm with casual impatience. No cruelty in the gesture, not really, just the thoughtless handling of property. And that is precisely what this child is now. Property. A thrall. The Old Norse word itself likely derives from a term meaning to run, or to be pressed down, and both meanings capture something essential about the condition. Thralls ran at their master's commands. Thralls were pressed down beneath the weight of a society that considered them less than fully human. You learn quickly that thralls in Viking society came from 2 primary sources. The first and most dramatic was capture during raids. When those dragon-prowed longships appeared on the horizon of an English monastery or an Irish coastal village, the warriors aboard were not just looking for gold and silver, they were shopping for labour. Healthy young men could work fields and row ships. Young women could serve in households and frequently in their masters' beds. Children could be raised into obedience, their memories of freedom fading like morning frost. The raids that terrorised medieval Europe were, in a very real sense, shopping expeditions. The second source was birth. Thralls bred more thralls. A child born to a thrall mother was automatically a thrall, regardless of who the father was. This created a self-perpetuating underclass, a permanent pool of human resources that required no dangerous voyages to replenish. Some masters actively encouraged their thralls to reproduce, viewing the resulting children as a return on investment, not unlike the calves born to their cattle. The language used in legal texts to describe thrall breeding is indistinguishable from the language used for livestock management, because in the eyes of Viking law there was no meaningful difference. You pause near the harbour where a larger ship is being unloaded. This vessel has just returned from the east, from the river routes that led through what is now Russia, down to the wealthy markets of Constantinople and beyond. The cargo being offloaded includes furs, amber, walrus ivory and people. Lots of people. They shuffle down the gangplank in a shuffling line, wrists bound with rope, eyes downcast. These are Slavs, captured from the lands that would eventually give the very word slave to European languages. The connection is not coincidental. Viking traders dealt so heavily in Slavic captives that the ethnic name became synonymous with the condition of bondage itself. The scale of this operation would stagger modern comprehension. Historians estimate that during the height of the Viking Age, thralls may have constituted as much as 20 to 30% of the Scandinavian population. Let that sink in for a moment. In some regions, nearly 1 in 3 people was property. The entire economic structure of Norse society rested on this foundation of unfree labour. The farms that fed the warriors, the ships that carried them to new conquests, the households that maintained the social order, all of it depended on thralls. A well-dressed man approaches the newly arrived captives with the practised eye of an expert. He is a thrall trader, a specialist in human merchandise, and his profession is entirely respectable here. He examines teeth to estimate age and health. He checks for signs of disease or injury that might reduce value. He asks the ship's captain about each captive's temperament. Docile ones fetch higher prices for household work, while spirited ones might be better suited to hard labour, where their defiance can be literally beaten out of them. The whole process has the business-like efficiency of any wholesale market. You learn that prices varied considerably based on the merchandise. A healthy adult male thrall might sell for the equivalent of 8 cows, a substantial sum that reflects both the labour value and the initial investment required to capture, transport and maintain human cargo. Young women often commanded higher prices, their value calculated in terms of both labour and reproductive potential. Skilled thralls, those who possessed useful trades like smithing or weaving, were premium commodities. A thrall who could read and write, rare as that was, might fetch astronomical sums from wealthy buyers seeking to impress their neighbours with such exotic property. The life awaiting these captives varied enormously depending on their luck. Household thralls in prosperous families might live relatively comfortable lives, eating decent food, wearing acceptable clothing, perhaps even developing genuine affection with their masters. Some thralls were eventually freed, either through purchase of their own liberty or as rewards for loyal service. A freed thrall became a leisingi, a person of limited rights who still owed obligations to their former master, but could own property, marry freely, and build something resembling a life. But this was the exception, not the rule. Most thralls laboured in conditions that would make modern prison work programs look like spa retreats. They cleared forests, drained bogs, hauled cargo, cleaned latrines and performed every back-breaking, soul-crushing task that free Vikings considered beneath their dignity. They could be beaten for any reason or no reason at all. They could be sold away from their families without warning. They could be killed by their masters with minimal legal consequence. Early Norse law codes imposed only modest fines for killing another person's thrall, treating it as property damage rather than homicide. Perhaps most disturbing was the sexual exploitation woven into the fabric of thrall existence. Female thralls were entirely at the mercy of their masters' desires, and those desires were frequently exercised. Children resulting from these assaults occupied a complicated legal position. Some masters acknowledged them as heirs, while others simply added them to the thrall population. The sagas mention these situations with remarkable casualness, treating the rape of enslaved women as unremarkable, certainly not worthy of moral commentary. You watch as the trader completes his assessment and begins negotiating with buyers who have gathered around the new arrivals. The haggling is spirited, even cheerful. Jokes are exchanged about the merchandise. One buyer complains that Slavic thralls are lazy compared to Irish ones, and another counters that at least Slavs do not try to escape as often. The captives stand in silence, understanding nothing of the language that determines their fates. The reach of this trade network genuinely spanned continents. Viking traders sold captives in the great markets of Hedeby and Birka in Scandinavia. They transported human cargo down the Russian rivers to Constantinople, where Byzantine nobles paid premium prices for exotic northern slaves. They dealt with Arab merchants who shipped their purchases further east, to the courts of Baghdad and beyond. An Irish monk captured in a raid on Lindisfarne might end up serving a caliph in the Middle East. A Slavic farmer's daughter might find herself in a Viking chieftain's bed in Iceland. The diaspora of suffering stretched across the known world. The Vikings did not invent slavery, of course. The practice existed across virtually every ancient civilization, from Greece and Rome to China and the Maya. But the Vikings systematized it, industrialized it, built commercial networks of unprecedented sophistication to move human beings from where they were captured to where they were wanted. They were remarkably good at it, these cheerful Scandinavian merchants of flesh, and they saw nothing wrong with any of it. Thralls were simply part of the natural order, as inevitable as the seasons, as unremarkable as the tides. The gods had made some people free and some people thralls, and questioning this arrangement would be like questioning why the sun rises in the east. This was perhaps the most shocking aspect of all, not the cruelty, which at least implied some awareness of inflicting suffering, but the sheer indifference, the normalization of treating human beings as things. As you leave the harbour behind, your head swimming with the implications of what you have witnessed, you nearly collide with that anxious mother you saw earlier. She's returning from the chieftain's longhouse, and you search her face for some indication of what happened there. The mother's face tells you everything before she speaks a word. Relief floods her features, her shoulders dropping from their tense position near her ears, and she clutches the bundled infant closer to her chest. The child has been accepted. The naming ceremony will proceed. This particular baby will live. But you understand now with sickening clarity that the outcome could have been very different. The practice of infant exposure, the deliberate abandonment of newborns to die from the elements, was not some rare occurrence in Viking society. It was a legally sanctioned, socially accepted method of population control that every family understood and many practiced. You find yourself following the mother at a distance, watching her rejoin her family near one of the longhouses. Her husband greets her with what appears to be genuine happiness, taking the baby and examining it with the proud smile of new fathers throughout history. Other children cluster around, eager to see their new sibling. It looks almost normal, almost like any family welcoming a new member. But the conversation you overhear chills that impression. The husband is discussing the examination that just occurred, how the chieftain's wife checked the infant for defects, tested its limbs for strength, listened to its cry for signs of vitality. The baby passed inspection. Another infant born to a family on the settlement's outskirts just days ago did not. That child was carried into the forest 3 nights past. No one speaks of it now. No one will speak of it again. The logic behind this practice was brutally simple. Life in Scandinavia during the Viking Age was harsh beyond modern imagination. The growing season was short, resources were limited, and every mouth to feed represented a calculation of survival. A child born with visible deformities, with signs of weakness, with any indication that it might not grow into a productive member of the household, was a liability the family might not be able to afford. Better to end things quickly, before emotional attachments formed, before the child consumed resources that could sustain its healthier siblings. The timing of the naming ceremony was crucial to this system. Until a child received its name, typically 9 days after birth, it existed in a legal and social limbo. It was not yet fully a person. It had no rights, no identity, no claim on the protection of law or community. during this 9-day window, the decision to expose remained entirely within the family's discretion. Once the naming occurred, once water was sprinkled on the infant's head and a name was spoken aloud, the child became human. Killing it, after that point, would be murder. You learn that the decision to expose typically rested with the father, though mothers and other family members certainly influenced the choice. A father might reject a child for numerous reasons. Obvious physical defects were the most common cause. A twisted limb, a cleft palate, blindness, or any condition that suggested the child would never work, fight, or contribute to household prosperity. But defects were not the only justification. Poverty drove many exposures. A family already struggling to feed existing children might simply lack the resources for another. Illegitimate births could prompt exposure, particularly if acknowledging the child would create social complications or inheritance disputes. Even gender played a role in some cases, though perhaps less than you might expect. Sons were generally preferred for their labour and military value, but daughters had economic worth too. They could be married advantageously, and their bride prices brought wealth to their families. Still, in times of genuine scarcity, daughters were more likely to face the forest than sons. The method of exposure was straightforward and terrible. The unwanted infant would be carried to a remote location, a forest, a mountainside, sometimes a shoreline, and simply left there. No violence was required. The cold would do the work, or predators, or simple starvation. The parent who performed this task was not considered a murderer. They had not killed the child. They had merely declined to sustain it. The distinction mattered enormously in the moral framework of the time. Some infants were placed in specific locations where they might theoretically be found by others willing to raise them. This provided a thin veneer of moral comfort. Perhaps the child would survive, taken in by a passing traveller or a childless couple. In practice, such rescues were rare. An infant left in the Scandinavian wilderness had virtually no chance of survival, unless discovery came within hours. The parents who exposed their children generally understood this. The possibility of rescue was a polite fiction that made the reality more bearable. Christianity would eventually abolish this practice. When Norse societies converted, beginning in the 10th and 11th centuries, the new faith brought new prohibitions. Infant exposure was declared murder, a mortal sin that endangered the soul. Interestingly, this change met significant resistance from populations who viewed exposure as a practical necessity rather than a moral failing. Some early conversion agreements actually included exemptions allowing exposure to continue for a transitional period. The Christians eventually won, of course, but the fact that such negotiations occurred reveals how deeply embedded the practice was. You wander toward the outskirts of the settlement, your thoughts heavy with what you have learned. Near the tree line, you notice a small group gathered around what appears to be a shrine of some kind. Wooden posts carved with intricate designs surround a central altar stone, dark stains discolouring its surface. A goat bleats nervously, held by a young man while an older figure in ceremonial dress prepares a blade. This is a blot, a sacrifice to the gods, and you have arrived just as the ritual reaches its climax. The blade flashes, the goat's cry cuts short, and blood pours onto the altar in a steaming rush. The officiant, a Gothi, a priest chieftain, catches the blood in a wide bowl and begins sprinkling it on the assembled worshippers with a bundle of twigs. They receive this blessing with closed eyes and reverent expressions, the goat's blood speckling their faces and clothes. You have witnessed the tamest version of what blot could entail. The animal sacrifice was the standard offering, performed at regular intervals to maintain the favour of the gods who controlled harvests, weather, and fortune in battle. But the stakes could escalate dramatically. Major festivals, times of crisis, moments when divine intervention seemed especially necessary. These occasions sometimes called for more significant offerings. Human sacrifice was not an everyday occurrence in Viking religious practice, but it was far from unknown. The historical and archaeological evidence points to a genuine tradition of killing people to please the gods, particularly in connection with major temples and during times of societal stress. The great temple at Uppsala in Sweden was notorious for its sacrificial rituals. Every 9 years, according to medieval accounts, a festival required the sacrifice of 9 males from every species, including humans. Their bodies hung from the sacred grove surrounding the temple, offerings to Odin, Thor and Freya. The god most associated with human sacrifice was Odin, the All-Father, the Lord of War and Wisdom and Death. Odin himself had sacrificed himself to himself, hanging on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain knowledge of the runes. His followers honoured this myth by offering victims in similar fashion, hanging, often combined with spear wounds, in groves dedicated to the one-eyed god. The victims might be captured enemies, condemned criminals, or occasionally volunteers who sought the honour of joining Odin's hall directly. The selection of human sacrifices followed its own terrible logic. Thralls were common victims, their lives considered less valuable than free persons. Prisoners of war faced the altar frequently, their deaths serving both religious and practical purposes. Criminals condemned to death might be executed as sacrifices rather than through secular punishment, giving their deaths cosmic significance. And sometimes, particularly in times of famine or military disaster, the community might select a victim from among its own free population, occasionally even a king, if the gods seem to demand the highest possible offering. The blood ritual continues before you, and you find yourself unable to look away. The Gothi has finished sprinkling the gathered worshippers, and now turns his attention to the wooden idol posts surrounding the altar. Each post bears a carved face representing one of the major gods, and each receives its share of the goat's cooling blood. The believers watch in silence, their speckled faces serene with faith. You begin to understand that blood was the essential currency of Viking religion. The gods required it. They hungered for it. Without regular offerings, the delicate balance between the divine and mortal realms would collapse, and the consequences would manifest in failed crops, storms that sank ships, enemies who proved victorious in battle. The blood that seemed so shocking to you was simply payment for services rendered, a transaction as straightforward as any conducted in the marketplace. The word blot itself carries this transactional meaning. Scholars trace it to concepts of strengthening, of blessing, of making sacred through blood. When a Viking farmer sacrificed a goat or a horse or a thrall, they were not merely killing, they were communicating, maintaining a relationship with powers far greater than themselves. The blood carried prayers upward. The flesh, often consumed in communal feasting after the ritual, carried divine blessing back to the human participants. The timing of major blots followed the agricultural and martial calendar with precision. The Winter Night celebration in late October marked the end of harvest and the beginning of the dark season, requiring sacrifices to ensure the community's survival through the lean months ahead. Yule in midwinter honoured the gods during the longest nights, when the boundary between worlds grew thin and spirits walked freely among the living. The spring sacrifice called for blood to awaken the earth and guarantee fertile fields. Each turning of the year demanded its own offerings, its own deaths. You watch as the community begins the feast portion of the ritual. The sacrificed goat is being butchered, its meat prepared for roasting over fires that have been burning since before dawn. The atmosphere shifts from solemn reverence to something almost festive. Ale flows freely. Laughter rises. Children chase each other between the cooking fires, while their elders discuss weather and politics and the prospects for next season's raids. The blood has been given. The gods are satisfied. Now the humans may celebrate. But your mind keeps returning to those other sacrifices, the ones involving human victims. The accounts that survive paint vivid and horrifying pictures. Adam of Bremen, an 11th century German chronicler, described the Uppsala temple's sacrificial grove in terms that still disturb readers a millennium later. Dogs, horses and men hung side by side from the sacred trees, their bodies left to rot as offerings to the divine. The grove itself was considered so holy that every tree, heavy with its decomposing fruit, held sacred significance. The method of human sacrifice varied according to which god received the offering. Odin, as you learned, preferred hanging and stabbing, echoing his own self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil. Victims destined for the All-Father might be strangled or hanged, then pierced with spears while still suspended. Some accounts suggest the victims were stabbed first, then hanged while dying, the combination of methods ensuring proper dedication. The phrase, given to Odin, appears in saga literature as a casual reference to this form of ritual killing, suggesting it was common enough to require no explanation. Thor, the thunder god, apparently preferred different methods. Archaeological evidence points to ritual drownings and deaths by bludgeoning in his honour. The hammer that Thor wielded against the giants found echo in the instruments used to dispatch his human offerings. Bodies recovered from bogs across Scandinavia and northern Germany show signs of elaborate ritual treatment, bound, strangled, throats cut, skulls crushed, suggesting these drowning victims were carefully prepared sacrifices rather than simple murder victims. Freya, the god of fertility and prosperity, received offerings aimed at ensuring abundant harvests and healthy livestock. Animals figured prominently in his worship, particularly horses, which held special sacred significance in Norse religion. But humans died for Freya too. Their blood meant to strengthen the land itself, to pour vital energy into soil that would soon receive seed. The selection process for human sacrifices carried its own ritual significance. Random victims would not do. The offering needed to mean something, to carry appropriate weight for the transaction being conducted. A captured enemy warrior, particularly one of high rank, made an excellent sacrifice. His death honoured the gods while simultaneously eliminating a threat and demonstrating the victor's power. The psychological impact on surviving enemies cannot be underestimated. Seeing your champion or your chief offered to foreign gods sent a message no mere execution could match. Criminals provided another source of sacrificial victims. A man condemned for theft or treachery or oath-breaking faced death regardless. Why not make that death serve the community's spiritual needs? The blurring of execution and sacrifice appears throughout the historical record. Victims were not simply killed, but killed correctly. With proper ritual observance, their deaths transformed from mere punishment into cosmic transaction. Voluntary sacrifice, while rare, did occur. The warrior culture of the Vikings celebrated death in battle as the highest possible end, a direct path to Odin's hall, where the Einherjar feasted and fought in preparation for Ragnarok. Some individuals extended this logic to ritual death, offering themselves to the gods in exchange for benefits to their families or communities. A dying man might request sacrifice rather than waiting for illness to claim him, ensuring he met death on his own terms and in a manner pleasing to the divine. The community gathered for these major sacrifices played essential roles in the ritual. They witnessed, they participated, they consumed the feast that followed, taking the sacred flesh into their own bodies. The blood sprinkle on their skin marked them as blessed, protected, connected to powers beyond mortal understanding. Children grew up watching these rituals, absorbing the lesson that blood payment was simply how the world worked. By the time they were old enough to participate actively, nothing about the practice seemed strange. You find yourself thinking about the psychological mechanisms that allowed otherwise ordinary people to participate in human sacrifice without apparent moral crisis. The answer lies partly in the absolute conviction that the gods were real, that their demands were legitimate, that failure to satisfy those demands would result in genuine catastrophe for the entire community. When you truly believe that a bad harvest will kill half your village, that storms will drown your sailors, that enemies will slaughter your children, the calculation changes. One death to prevent many deaths stops looking like murder and starts looking like mercy. The social context reinforced these beliefs at every turn. Everyone you knew participated in blot. Everyone accepted its necessity. The priests who conducted sacrifices were respected community leaders, not marginalized fanatics. The kings and jarls offered sacrifices publicly, demonstrating piety that validated their authority. To question the practice was to question the entire order of existence, and such questions simply did not occur to most people. The blood flowed because it had always flowed, because the gods demanded it, because refusing would doom everyone. Christianity's eventual triumph over Norse paganism meant the end of blood sacrifice in Scandinavia. The new religion brought its own sacrificial theology, the crucified Christ as the ultimate and final blood offering, but insisted that human hands need not repeat the gesture. Missionaries worked to reframe sacrifice as barbarism, as demon worship, as everything a civilized Christian society must reject. The transition was neither quick nor clean. For generations, converts hedged their bets, maintaining old rituals alongside new prayers. Archaeological evidence shows Christian graves with decidedly pagan grave goods, suggesting the dead were being prepared for multiple possible afterlives. Sacrificial traditions lingered in folk practices long after formal conversion, their meanings gradually forgotten even as the gestures persisted. You leave the blot behind as the feast reaches its height, the sounds of celebration fading as you walk toward another part of the settlement. Near the waterfront you notice a different kind of gathering forming, a crowd arranging itself in a rough circle around two men who stand facing each other with murder in their eyes. The two men in the circle are not what draws your immediate attention. It is the third figure, standing apart, who makes your blood run cold. He is naked from the waist up despite the biting wind, his torso covered in fresh scars that look self-inflicted. His eyes roll back in his head as he rocks back and forth, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. He's biting down on the edge of his shield, actually gnawing the wood like a starving dog with a bone, splinters mixing with the blood that flows from his gums. This is a berserker in the early stages of working himself into the battle rage, and everyone gives him a wide berth. Even the hardened warriors in the crowd watch him with a mixture of respect and unease. You're witnessing the deliberate cultivation of madness, the methodical destruction of all human restraint, the transformation of a man into something that exists purely to kill. The word berserker translates roughly to bear shirt, referring to the pelts these warriors wore into battle. Some dressed as bears, others as wolves, Ylfednar or wolf coats, but the principle remained constant. By taking on the skin of a predator, they sought to take on its nature. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They genuinely believed they became the beast, that Odin himself possessed them, and turned them into unstoppable killing machines immune to pain, fear, and the limitations of normal human endurance. You watch as the berserker's preparation intensifies. He has stopped gnawing his shield and begun a rhythmic chant, though the words are incomprehensible, more growl than language. His companions, because even berserkers rarely worked alone, begin pounding their weapons against their shields in rhythm with his chanting. The sound builds, primal and threatening, and you feel your own heart rate accelerating in response. This is psychological warfare at its most basic level, the weaponization of pure animalistic terror. The historical sagas describe berserkers performing incredible feats while in their fury. They would fight naked in the snow, impervious to cold that would kill normal men. They would catch spears thrown at them and hurl them back. They would bite through enemy shields, tear apart armor with their bare hands, continue fighting with mortal wounds that should have dropped them immediately. Some accounts claim they could blunt enemy weapons just by looking at them, though this probably reflects the psychological impact of facing an opponent who seemed utterly indifferent to being cut. But here is what the sagas often gloss over. The berserker rage was not some mystical gift from the gods, it was induced, deliberately, chemically. These warriors used a cocktail of techniques and substances to drive themselves into their fighting madness, and the process was as calculated as any battlefield strategy. The most likely candidate for their chemical enhancement was Amanita muscaria, the distinctive red and white spotted mushroom that grows throughout Scandinavia. Consumed in proper doses, this fungus produces effects that align remarkably well with berserker behavior. Heightened strength, reduced pain sensitivity, distorted perception, uncontrollable rage, and afterward, complete exhaustion and memory loss. The mushrooms were probably consumed as part of pre-battle rituals, their psychoactive compounds flooding the warrior's system just as combat began, but mushrooms were only part of the formula. Berserkers also used ritualized pain to alter their consciousness. Those scars you noticed on the warrior's torso were not battle wounds, but deliberate self-mutilation, each cut flooding his system with adrenaline and endorphins. They would work themselves into hyperventilation, drastically altering their blood chemistry. They would fast for days before battle, pushing their bodies into altered metabolic states. They would consume massive quantities of alcohol, though this was probably more for afterward. Even berserkers needed something to dull the aftermath of their rampages. The psychological preparation mattered as much as the physical. Berserkers would meditate on violence, visualizing themselves as beasts, rehearsing the motions of killing until the actions became automatic. They would invoke Odin, the god of battle madness, asking him to possess their bodies and turn them into extensions of his rage. This was not prayer in any gentle sense. It was deliberate cultivation of dissociation, training the mind to separate from the body's actions, to watch from somewhere else while the flesh did terrible things. You see this dissociation happening now in the warrior before you. His eyes have gone completely vacant, pupils dilated until they are black pools. He has stopped his chanting and gone eerily still, but his muscles twitch and jump beneath his skin like something else is trying to escape. When he moves, and the movement comes without warning, it is with explosive violence. He launches himself at a wooden practice post, attacking it with his teeth and nails, tearing chunks of wood away while making sounds that belong in no human throat. The crowd watches in fascinated horror. Parents pull their children back, even the warriors look uncomfortable. Because here is the dark truth about berserkers. They were as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy. Once the rage took hold, distinguishing friend from foe became impossible. Berserkers were typically deployed at the front of battle formations, pointed at the enemy, and released like living weapons. But they could just as easily turn on their own forces, lost in a red haze where everything that moved became something to destroy. The sagas contain numerous accounts of berserkers causing problems in peacetime. The rage did not always wait for battle. Some berserkers would fall into their fury over minor insults, destroying property, killing livestock, murdering anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby when the madness struck. They would challenge other warriors to homegang duels for trivial reasons, using their reputation and battle rage to terrorize communities. Some Viking leaders actually outlawed berserkers from their territories, considering them too unstable to tolerate even in a society that celebrated violence. Kings' retainers often included berserkers as elite bodyguards and shock troops, but managing them required careful handling. They needed to be kept fed, entertained, and supplied with outlets for their aggression. Like keeping barely domesticated wolves, the arrangement worked only as long as you never forgot what they really were. Stories tell of kings who lost control of their berserkers and paid terrible prices, their own elite warriors becoming the greatest threat to their authority. The physical cost of the berserker rage was devastating. After the fury passed, and it always passed, usually within an hour or two, the warrior would collapse into a state the sagas call berserker weakness. They would become feeble as infants, unable to stand, sometimes unable to speak. They would shake uncontrollably, vomit, suffer splitting headaches. Some fell into depression so severe they became suicidal. The human body was not meant to endure what berserkers forced upon themselves, and every rage extracted payment in damaged nerves, strained hearts, and fractured minds. Many berserkers died young, their bodies simply giving out after too many transformations. Others descended into permanent madness, the line between man and beast erased beyond recovery. The lucky ones died in battle during their rage, going to Valhalla in the full flower of their terrible glory. The unlucky ones lived to become broken old men, twitching at shadows, starting at sudden sounds, forever trapped between two states of being. You watch as the berserker finally exhausts himself against the practice post, which now looks like it was attacked by a bear. He drops to his knees, panting, blood running from dozens of self-inflicted wounds where splinters pierced his skin. His companions approach carefully, ready to restrain him if the rage flares again, but he seems spent. They wrap him in a cloak and lead him away, and the crowd disperses with visible relief. But you notice something else happening nearby. The two men who were facing each other when you arrived have not abandoned their confrontation. If anything, the berserker's display has heightened the tension between them. They are negotiating something through intermediaries, establishing terms and conditions. You recognize the formulaic language even without understanding every word. They are arranging a holmgang, and from the grim expressions on everyone's faces, this one will not end with first blood. The negotiations conclude with sharp nods from both parties.
Honor,
the holmgang will take place at dawn
and
tomorrow on the small island visible from the harbour. Holmganger traditionally
every
occurred on
movement
islands or other
around
bounded
you
spaces, the
before
isolation
you
serving both
even
practical and symbolic
realize
purposes.
you
No one can
reinside
interfere.
something
No
much
one can flee.
larger
The
than
matter
a
will be
single
settled definitively,
settlement
probably with
mood.
death. You edge closer
step
to
out
one of the witnesses,
longhouse
an older woman who seems
into
eager
the
to share the
sharp
gossip.
Coastal wind,
Through a
and
combination
the
of her
clang
broken attempts at
metal
languages you
hits
partially
your
understand and
ears
elaborate gesturing,
instantly.
you piece together the
Two
cause of this
young
formal
men
duel.
are sparring
One man accused
beside
the other
a
of cheating in
pile
a
of
trade deal
chopped
involving walrus ivory.
firewood.
The accused man
Wooden
responded by
shields
suggesting the accuser's
slamming
mother had
together
entertained rather
with
too many
enough
visiting merchants in her
force to
youth.
rattle your
Words
ribs.
escalated. Someone mentioned
They're
cowardice,
not
and now,
practicing
over
for
what amounts to a
sport.
business dispute and a
They're
your mom joke,
rehearsing
two
for
men will try to
real
kill each other at
violence.
sunrise,
The
and everyone treats
kind
this
that
as a reasonable
isn't
resolution.
optional in
The
this
holmgang was not
world.
mere barbarism dressed in
Here,
ritual clothing.
Honor
It was a legally
is
sanctioned
living
judicial mechanism,
creature,
as formal and
always
binding as any
awake,
modern court proceeding.
always hungry.
The word itself means island
and it
going,
demands
referring to the traditional
constant
practice of
feeding
conducting these
through
duels on islands,
strength,
or marked spaces
bravery,
that separated the
and
combat from ordinary
readiness.
ground.
The
When two
older
parties could not resolve a
warrior
dispute through negotiation or
supervising them
compensation,
watches
when honour
with
had been
arms
questioned in ways that
crossed,
words could not repair, the
expression
holmgang provided a
neutral.
final arbiter. Violence,
Docent
controlled and
flinch
witnessed,
when
with the
one
survivor
boy
declared
takes a
legally and morally
shield
correct.
to the nose,
The rules were extensive and
blood
specific,
drips down
varying
his
somewhat by
lip.
region but maintaining
Instead,
consistent core
He
principles.
nods
Both parties had to
approvingly.
agree to the duel,
Good,
though refusing a
he
holmgang
says.
challenge carried such devastating
to
social
bleed
consequences
here
that
than
agreement was
later.
essentially mandatory.
The boy
To decline was
wipes
to admit
his
cowardice,
face,
to accept
lifts
guilt,
his
to forfeit
shield,
all claim to honour and respect.
charges again with
In a
more
society where reputation
determination.
determined everything from
You
business dealings to marriage
instinctively
prospects,
step backward,
refusing a holmgang was social
trying
suicide.
not to become
3 shields were allowed to each
collateral
combatant.
damage
When a
in
shield
this
broke,
lesson.
you could replace it.
And the
After the
warrior
3rd shield shattered, you
glances
continued
at
with
you.
whatever protection remained.
If you can
Swords
walk,
were the traditional
you
weapons,
can
though
fight,
axes appeared in some
he
duels.
mutters.
The challenged party
You
struck
nod
first,
politely,
a significant advantage that slightly
pretending you
balanced the scales
agree.
for someone forced to defend
Even
against
though your
accusations.
modern legs
Combat
feel
continued until
more
first blood,
suited for
serious
jogging
injury,
away
or
from
death,
danger
depending on what the
than
parties
to
agreed
ward it.
beforehand.
As you
But here is
follow
where it
the
gets
path
interesting.
up
You could have
the
someone fight
ward,
for you.
the ridge
Champions existed,
overlooking the
professional
fjord.
duelists who would represent
Two
clients in
women
holmgang for a
approach,
fee.
carrying baskets
This
of
created an
dried
entire economy
fish.
around formalized violence.
Even in
Wealthy
their
men could hire
brisk
skilled
pace,
fighters to settle their
you
disputes.
catch the
Poor men who
low,
could not afford champions or
clipped
lacked combat
tone
skills
of their
faced terrible
whispers.
choices. Fight and
They're
likely die,
discussing
refuse and be
afoot
destroyed socially,
casually,
or abandon their claims
like you
entirely.
might discuss
Some men made
a
careers out of
neighbor's
holmgang
loud
abuse.
music.
They would travel from district to
Something
district,
about
challenging
two
wealthy landowners to
families
duels over
arguing
manufactured slights.
over
The
grazing
challenge party
rights,
faced the same
and
impossible
an
choice.
insult
Fight a
thrown
professional
at a
killer or surrender property and
gathering last
reputation.
month.
These holmgang
You
bullies became
assume
such a
it's
problem
minor,
that eventually laws were passed
but
to restrict
one
the
woman
practice,
shrugs
requiring more substantial
and
causes for
says,
challenges
"If
and
he
limiting the
doesn't
property transfers that could
apologize
result from
soon,
victory.
there will
The property
be
aspect
trouble."
deserves emphasis because it
Trouble
reveals how the
here
holmgang
does
functioned
not
as more than
mean
just dispute
awkward
resolution.
silence
When a man
or
died in holmgang, his
passive-aggressive
killer often gained legal
glances.
claim to some or all of his
Trouble
possessions.
means blood.
Kill a man over an insult, inherit his
Trouble
farm,
means
slaughter
payback.
someone in a dispute about
Trouble
boundaries,
means
take the
someone
disputed land
grabs an
plus
axe
compensation.
and
The economic
someone else
incentive for skilled
doesn't
fighters to
come
seek
home.
duels was enormous.
That's not
The saga's record
melodrama.
men who built
It's
considerable
the
wealth through strategic home gang
expectation.
victories,
You
essentially
hear
using
more
murder as an
about
investment
it
strategy.
when you reach
You
the
spend the
ridge
evening learning
where
more
a
about
group
tomorrow's
of
combatants.
men are
The accuser,
repairing
the
a
one who initiated
damaged
the challenge,
shield.
is a merchant named
He
Thorkel,
dishonored
successful
my
enough to own 3
father.
ships but not wealthy
One
enough to hire a
young
champion.
warrior
The
says,
accused is Grim, a
tightening
farmer with
leather
military experience
strap.
from raids on the
If
English
he
coast.
won't take
The betting heavily favours Grimmer.
responsibility,
He is
then
younger,
the
stronger,
gods
and
will
has actually
see his
killed men before.
shamed.
Thorkel
I'll
is
make
fighting for
sure
principle and
everyone
reputation,
else
but
sees
principles
it
offer
too.
poor protection against
He
iron.
speaks with
The social
calm
dynamics around the Holmgang fascinate you.
certainty of
People
someone
discuss tomorrow's duel with the same
weather
energy your era
patterns.
reserves for sporting events.
This is the
They analyze
rhythm
technique,
of life
debate strategy,
in Viking
share stories of
society.
famous Holmgangs from the past.
Reputation
An old man
is
regales a crowd with the
collective
tale of
currency.
Egil
You
Skallagrimsson,
don't just
the warrior poet who
defend
won
your
multiple
own
Holmgangs despite
honor.
being past his
You
prime,
defend
using
your
cunning and poetry
entire
to defeat
clan.
younger opponents. Another
Honor
describes a
is
duel
as
where both combatants
tangible
died from their
as
wounds,
land,
leaving the witnesses to puzzle
as
out who technically won.
measurable as livestock,
Women have their own complex relationship
as
with
fragile
Holmgang culture.
as a
They could
thin
not
piece
participate
of
directly.
ice
Viking
floating
society
on the
allowed women
fjord.
many freedoms
You
but drew
break
firm
it,
lines around formal
and
violence.
everyone
However,
feels it.
women could incite
You
men to
lose it,
Holmgang through carefully
and
deployed
your
shame.
world
A
collapses.
wife questioning her husband's courage,
This
a mother
constant
lamenting her son's
pressure
damaged honor,
shapes
a
how
sister wondering
people
aloud why her
move
brother
and
tolerated such
speak.
insults. These
When
interventions
two
pushed
men
countless men
cross
onto the dueling
paths
ground.
on the
The sagas
narrow
treat such
trail,
incitement as natural
they don't
female
just
behavior,
pass
sometimes
each
admiring
other.
the clever woman
They
who manipulated men
assess,
into fighting her
they
battles.
measure,
Children grew up watching
they watch
Holmgangs,
for
absorbing the
slights.
lesson that violence resolved
Even
disputes and death
silence
was an acceptable
feels
price for honor.
charged.
Boys practiced
And
Holmgang rules in their
insults
games,
you
using wooden
discover
swords and
are
shields,
dangerous.
learning the formalities alongside the fighting
Not the
techniques.
playful
By
teasing
adulthood, the system
modern
seemed as natural as
people
breathing.
exchange
Of course, you
in
fought
group
duels over
chats.
insults. Of course, you risked
Real
death for reputation.
insults,
What else could a real man
accusations
do?
of
The
cowardice,
Holmgang served functions beyond
theft,
individual dispute resolution.
treachery,
It reinforced
or,
social hierarchies.
worst of all,
Skilled warriors accumulated power
dishonoring
through duels,
someone's
while weak or
wife
cowardly men
sister
lost standing.
or
It prevented larger
sparks
conflicts by
thrown
containing
into
violence
dry
within ritual
brush.
boundaries.
Even
Instead of
an
families pursuing
offhand
blood feuds that could
comment
devastate
can
entire
echo
districts,
across
individuals settled matters
families
through formal
and
combat.
ignite
The
something
Holmgang was, in its way, a mechanism for limiting
A
violence
man
even
with
while celebrating it.
braided beard and a
As night
wolf
falls,
fur
you find
cape
yourself near the harbour,
stands
watching
near
men prepare
you
the Holmgang
as
ground on the
group
island.
continues to repair
They're marking out the
gear.
combat space with hazel rods,
If
creating a
someone
square roughly
insults
3
you,
meters on each
he
side.
says,
Cloaks are laid at the
without
corners,
turning his
their purpose
head,
both practical,
you
marking
must
boundaries,
respond.
and symbolic, creating sacred
If
space
you
where blood
don't,
could legally flow.
You admit
An ox
the
will be
insult
sacrificed at dawn
is
before
true.
the duel, its blood
He
consecrating the
looks at
ground,
you then,
making the violence that
eyes
follows a religious
sharp,
as well as legal act.
and nothing
The preparation
ruins
has the
man
feeling of a ritual that has been
faster than
performed
being
countless
thought
times,
weak.
each movement practiced
You
and
want to
purposeful.
tell him
The
that
men
in
setting
your
up the space chat
time,
casually as they work,
ignoring
discussing the weather,
someone
comparing
is
the setup to
often
previous
recommended
Holmgangs they
by
had witnessed.
experts
One mentions
and
that the last duel here
therapists.
ended when the victor
But
slipped on blood
something
and broke his
tells
neck,
you
making the
he
god's
isn't in
judgment
the
somewhat
mood
ambiguous.
for
They
a
laugh
TED
at this.
Talk.
Death by
Down the
irony
hill,
apparently never gets
a
old.
group of
You think about
children
Thorkel probably lying awake
practice
tonight,
throwing
knowing that his
small
pride has led him to
axes
this
at
moment.
tree
He
stumps.
could have absorbed the insult,
One
accepted the trade loss, moved on with his life.
and the axe
Instead, he chose to risk
spins
everything on
into the
combat
dirt.
against a younger,
The
stronger
other
opponent.
children
The
laugh
social
not
programming runs so
kindly.
deep that death seems
The boy
preferable to
looks
damaged
at them,
reputation.
cheeks
You wonder if he
flushed,
regrets the challenge,
breath
if he is searching
quickening.
for some honourable way
Then
to
he
withdraw,
retrieves
but there is no
the
withdrawal
axe
now.
and
The arrangements
tries
are made,
again.
the witnesses notified,
Jaw
the ground
clenched.
prepared.
Even
The
at
Holmgang
10
represents
years
something
old,
fundamental
he
about
knows
Viking society.
failure
the belief that violence was not civilization's opposite but its foundation. Laws existed, complex ones, but behind every law stood the threat of formalized killing.
Respect.
Justice meant not abstract principles, but concrete consequences, usually involving sharp iron. Order emerged not from suppressing violence, but channeling it through acceptable forms. The Holmgang was civilization itself, red in tooth and claw. Tomorrow, Thorkel and Grimmer will enter that marked square on the island. They will face each other with swords while the community watches. One or both will die. The survivor will be legally correct in whatever dispute started this. The dead man's family will accept the outcome because that is what families do. And life in the settlement will continue, the Holmgang having served its purpose, violence having answered the questions that words could not resolve. Dawn arrives grey and cold, and you do not go to witness the Holmgang. The crowd heading toward the island includes most of the settlement, eager for blood sport with their morning meal. But your attention has been caught by a different gathering near the chieftain's longhouse. A marriage negotiation is underway, and what you observe there proves just as shocking as any duel. The bride stands to one side, silent and still. She's perhaps 12 years old, 13 at most, her body caught in that awkward transition between child and woman. She wears her finest clothes, a blue woolen dress with intricate embroidery, silver brooches, her hair elaborately braided with ribbons that probably cost more than most families see in a year. Her face remains carefully neutral, but you catch her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress, the only sign of the anxiety she must feel. The groom is 35, a successful trader with connections stretching from Iceland to Constantinople. He examines the girl with the same calculating expression you saw on the thrall merchant's face, though his interest is legal rather than commercial. This is his third marriage. His previous wives died in childbirth, a common enough occurrence that it barely merits mention in the negotiations. He needs sons to inherit his wealth, and this girl, barely past her first bleeding, represents potential offspring. Her father conducts the actual negotiations while she stands there like a particularly valuable piece of furniture. The discussion centers on the bride price, the munda, which the groom must pay to secure marriage rights. They haggle over silver, land, cattle, trade goods. The girl's value is being calculated in precise economic terms. Her youth, her father's status, the demonstrated fertility from her mother's many children, the strategic value of alliance between the two families. Love does not enter the equation, neither does her consent, not really. The minimum legal age for marriage in Viking society was 12 for girls, 15 for boys, though these were minimums, not averages. Many girls married between 12 and 15, while boys typically waited until their 20s, when they had accumulated enough wealth to afford a bride price and maintain a household. This age disparity was standard across medieval Europe. The Vikings took it to extremes that shocked even their contemporaries. The negotiations continue for hours. Beyond the munda, they must settle the girl's dowry, property that remains technically hers, though her husband will control it during marriage. They discuss the morning gift, a separate payment the groom will make after consummating the marriage, a kind of sexual compensation that becomes the wife's personal property. Every detail requires careful consideration because marriage in Viking society was not primarily about uniting two people, but about joining two families' economic and political interests. You learn that marriages were typically arranged by families, with women having limited say in their futures. A father could legally betroth his daughter without her consent. If she had no father, that right passed to her brothers, uncles, or other male relatives. The girl watching her bride price being negotiated has probably known for years that this day would come, that her body would be bartered for family advantage. Yet, and this is where Viking society becomes unexpectedly complex, married women possessed rights that would have seemed revolutionary in contemporary Christian Europe. They could own property independently. They maintained control of their dowries. They could conduct business, appear as witnesses in legal proceedings, and run households with considerable autonomy. Most surprisingly, they could divorce their husbands with relative ease. The divorce laws reveal a fascinating contradiction in Viking gender relations. The same society that married off 12-year-old girls granted those girls, once married, the power to end their marriages for numerous causes. A woman could divorce her husband for physical abuse, for economic failure, for excessive absence, for sexual inadequacy, even for wearing clothing she deemed too effeminate. The process was straightforward. Declare the divorce before witnesses and the marriage ended. The woman retained her dowry, her mourning gift, and often received additional compensation. Men could divorce too, of course, with similarly broad grounds. But the relative equality of divorce law meant that Viking wives possessed leverage unknown to women in Christian kingdoms, where marriage was indissoluble sacrament. A Viking husband who mistreated his wife risked not just losing her, but losing her property and facing social humiliation. The threat of divorce provided some check on husbandly tyranny, though how much protection this offered a 12-year-old bride married to a man 3 times her age remains debatable. The sexual dynamics of Viking marriage were equally complex. Adultery laws applied to both sexes, though with predictable double standards. A married woman who took a lover faced severe penalties, potentially including death. A married man who slept with unmarried women or thralls faced no legal consequences, though bedding another man's wife could trigger bloody vengeance. The marriage bed itself was governed by explicit expectations. Both parties had conjugal rights, and persistent refusal of sex constituted grounds for divorce. Children complicated everything. The woman's primary value in marriage was reproductive, her worth measured in sons produced. Infertility was grounds for divorce, though Viking medical understanding meant the woman was always blamed for childlessness. Multiple pregnancies were expected and began immediately. The 12-year-old bride would likely be pregnant within the year, facing childbirth with a body barely developed enough to survive the process. The negotiations conclude with an agreement. The Munda is set at an impressive sum that reflects both families' status. The wedding will occur in 3 days, barely enough time for preparations but suggesting urgency. Perhaps the groom leaves soon on a trading voyage, or perhaps the girl's father wants the alliance secured before political winds shift. The girl is led away to begin her preparation, her face still that careful mask that reveals nothing. You follow at a distance and observe the women's preparations. The bride must be instructed in her duties, a crash course in managing a household she's barely old enough to understand. Older women, her mother and aunts, explain sexual obligations in terms that make you deeply uncomfortable. The mechanical necessities of pleasing a husband, of conceiving quickly, of enduring what must be endured. They speak of these things practically, without romance or sentiment, the same way they might explain how to preserve meat or weave cloth. The wedding feast itself will be elaborate, a public demonstration of both families' wealth and the alliance's importance. The religious ceremonies blend pagan and practical elements. Thor's hammer will be placed in the bride's lap to ensure fertility, oaths will be sworn before witnesses, and the marriage will be sealed with an exchange of swords, representing the transfer of protection from father to husband. The girl will go from her father's property to her husband's property, the main difference being that her husband will have sexual access to that property. You think about the trajectory of this girl's life. If she survives her first childbirth, and that is a significant if, she will bear children repeatedly until her body gives out or menopause grants reprieve. She will manage a complex household, overseeing thralls and servants, maintaining economic records, preserving food, producing textiles, all while navigating the dangerous politics of marriage to an older, wealthy man who might have mistresses, who certainly has enemies, who sees her primarily as a vehicle for legitimate heirs. If she's lucky, she might grow to feel affection for her husband, or at least achieve a working partnership based on mutual benefit. If she is unlucky, she faces decades of misery, though with divorce as a potential escape route should things become unbearable. If she's very unlucky, She dies in her first childbirth,
society,
another casualty of
honor
Viking society's
isn't
desperate
an
need to
idea.
reproduce itself in a harsh
It's a
environment where death
demand,
came early and
a
often.
mandate,
The marriage practices of the Vikings reflected their pragmatic approach to survival and social organization. Women were resources to be managed, their reproductive capacity too valuable to waste on romantic notions of choice or consent. Yet those same women, once married, wielded surprising authority within their households and retained rights that protected them from the worst excesses of patriarchal control. The 12-year-old bride was both victim and potential victor, powerless in her assignment but powerful in her position once assigned. 3 days later, you attend the wedding feast, but the celebration is overshadowed by darker news. Remember the holmgang between Thorkel and Grimmer. Grimmer won, as expected, running Thorkel through with a thrust that punctured lung and heart. Thorkel died, drowning in his own blood while trying to speak his wife's name. But the story does not end there. Never does. Thorkel's eldest son, a boy of 16 named Bjorn, sat through the wedding feast you're attending, drinking steadily, his eyes fixed on nothing. Halfway through the night he stands, raises his horn of ale, and makes an oath before the entire hall. He will have blood for blood. Grimmer or Grimmer's kin will die by his hand before the year is out. The wedding guests fall silent. The bride, that 12-year-old girl whose negotiations you witnessed, goes pale beneath her veil. Everyone understands what just began. This is how blood feuds start. Not with grand declarations of war, but with young men making promises over ale, with fathers dying in holmgangs that were supposed to settle matters, with the simple arithmetic of honor that demands every death be answered with death. Bjorn has just transformed a concluded legal duel into something that could consume both families for generations. The Icelandic sagas, those remarkable windows into Viking society, are essentially catalogues of blood feuds. Family kills family, each death justified by the last, each killing demanding the next. The Njal saga, perhaps the greatest of these tales, chronicles a feud that spans decades and kills dozens, all stemming from a petty dispute over seating arrangements at a feast. The logic was inexorable. If your kinsman was killed, you had not just the right, but the obligation to seek vengeance. Failure to pursue blood vengeance marked you as Nidinga, a nothing man beneath contempt. The legal framework actually encouraged this cycle. Viking law recognized vengeance killing as legitimate when properly conducted. If someone killed your family member, you could legally kill them or one of their family members of equivalent social value. The key word there is equivalent. Killing someone of higher status than your murdered relative would itself demand vengeance, escalating the conflict. Kill someone of lower status, and you fail to balance the scales, leaving your family's honor unsatisfied. This system created intricate calculations of blood debt. Is a younger brother worth an eldest son? Does killing a warrior nephew balance the death of a farmer uncle? What if the original victim was drunk and started the fight? Does that reduce the response killing from a patriarch to a second cousin? These were not abstract philosophical questions, but practical matters discussed in thing assemblies and family councils, deliberated with the same careful attention given to property disputes or trade agreements. You watch Grimmer receive news of Bjorn's oath. He does not seem surprised or particularly concerned. He has sons of his own, brothers, cousins, a network of kinship that stretches across the district. If Bjorn comes for him, Bjorn will die. When Bjorn's brothers will come, then Grimmer's sons will respond. The spiral is as predictable as winter following autumn, and everyone simply accepts it. The temporal scope of these feuds defied modern comprehension. Sons inherited their father's blood debts like property. A man might die peacefully in his bed, believing some ancient feud settled, only for his grandson to be murdered decades later by someone pursuing a vengeance claim from before the killer was born. The sagas record feuds that paused for entire generations, families
Trouble
coexisting
means
peacefully,
payback.
intermarrying, trading,
Trouble
before
means
some spark
someone
reignited the old
grabs an
hatred and
axe
bodies began
and
dropping
someone
again.
else
Women
doesn't
played complex
come
roles in
home.
blood feuds.
That's
They could not directly participate in
melodrama.
killing, but often
It's
served as
the
instigators, memory
expectation.
keepers, and
You
strategic
hear
planners.
more about
A mother might
when
raise her
you
sons on
reach the
stories of their
ridge,
murdered
where a
grandfather,
group
nurturing
of
hatred
men
like a
are
poisonous garden
repairing a
until her
damaged
boys were old enough to
shield.
harvest vengeance.
He dishonored
Wives
my
goaded
father.
reluctant husbands into
One
pursuing
young
feuds,
warrior
questioning their manhood
says,
until honor demanded action.
tightening a leather strap.
Some women manipulated
If he
feuds
won't
brilliantly,
take
orchestrating the destruction of
responsibility,
enemies while
then
keeping
the
their own hands
gods will
technically
see
clean.
his shame
The
in
economic impact of
I'll
sustained
make
feuds
sure
was devastating.
everyone else sees
Every adult
it
male
too.
killed represented lost
He
labor,
speaks
lost
with the
military
calm
capability, lost economic productivity.
certainty of someone
Farms fell into
discussing
disrepair as
weather
families focused
patterns.
resources on warfare rather than
This is
agriculture.
the rhythm of
Trade relationships
life
collapsed
in
when merchant
Viking
families feared
society.
traveling through districts where they might be targeted for
Reputation
ancestral
is
sins.
collective
Entire
currency.
regions could be economically
You
crippled
don't
by
just
sufficiently intense
defend your
feuds.
own
Yet
honor.
Viking society
You
developed
defend
mechanisms to
your
contain and
entire
conclude feuds
clan.
before total destruction.
Honor is as
The
tangible
Thing assemblies could
as
impose settlements,
land,
forcing families to accept
as
vergild,
measurable
blood money,
as
instead of blood
livestock,
vengeance. The amount
as
varied based on the
fragile
victim's
as
social
a
status.
thin piece
A
of
thrall
ice
might be worth a few
floating
silver
on the
pieces, a
fjord.
freeman several
You
marks,
break
a
it,
chieftain a
and
fortune in silver and
everyone
land.
feels it.
Accepting
You lose
vergil
it,
ended the legal right
and
to
your
vengeance,
world
though
collapses.
whether it ended the emotional need was
This
another matter
constant
entirely.
pressure
Arbitration
shapes
through
how
neutral
people
parties offered
move
another escape
and
route.
speak.
Respected individuals,
When two
often
men
chieftains
cross
or wealthy
paths
landowners
on
with
the
connections to
narrow
both feuding
trail,
families, could
they
broker
don't
peace
just
agreements.
pass each
These
other.
typically involved complex
They
exchanges of
assess,
property,
they
strategic
measure,
marriages to bind the families
they
together,
watch for
and public
slights.
reconciliation ceremonies where
Even
former enemies swore
silence
oaths of friendship.
feels charged.
The oaths were sacred,
And
sworn on arm
insults
rings and
you
weapons, invoking
discover
gods to witness
are
the peace.
dangerous.
Breaking such oaths invited
Not the
divine punishment,
playful
alongside
teasing
resumed
modern
human violence.
people exchange
Christianity
in
eventually
group
provided
chats.
new frameworks for ending feuds.
Real insults,
The Church condemned vengeance,
accusations
preaching
of
forgiveness,
cowardice,
and threatening eternal
theft,
damnation for those who pursued blood
treachery,
feuds.
or
Conversion
worst
sometimes
of
offered
all,
families an honourable way to abandon
dishonoring
vengeance
someone's
obligations.
wife
They could
or
claim their new faith
sister-in-law.
forbade what honour previously
Sparks
demanded.
thrown
This religious
into
escape
dry
hatch
brush.
probably saved countless
Even
lives during
an
Scandinavia's
offhand
gradual
comment
Christianization.
can echo across
But on this night,
families
in this hall,
and ignite
Christianity remains a
something
distant rumour, and Bjorn's oath hangs in the air like smoke
A
from the
man
cooking
with
fires.
braided
You notice the
beard
strategic
and a
repositioning
wolf
already
fur
beginning.
cape
Grimmer's kinsmen
stands
cluster
near
together,
you
discussing
as the
whether to
group
strike first or wait for
continues
Bjorn's
to
move.
repair gear.
Bjorn's family argues about
If
supporting his
someone
oath.
insults
Some see
you,
opportunity to
he
claim
says,
Thorkel's wealth by pursuing the
without
feud.
turning his
Others fear the
head,
cost in blood
you
and silver.
must respond.
The bride sits through all
If
of
you
this,
don't,
understanding
you
that her new
admit
marriage has been
the
overshadowed by
insult
promised
is
death.
True.
Her husband,
He
the
looks
trader,
at you
is already
then,
calculating how this feud
eyes
might affect his
sharp,
business.
and
Will
nothing
Grimmer's family
ruins a
disrupt his
man
trade routes?
faster
Should he
than
distance
being
himself from his
thought
wife's family
weak.
to avoid becoming a target?
You want to tell him
The poor girl
that
has
in
been
your
married into a
time,
world where violence ripples outward in
ignoring
waves,
someone
touching everyone
is
eventually.
often recommended
You learn that
by
managing feuds required
experts
constant
and
vigilance.
therapists.
Families maintained detailed
But
mental
something
records of
tells
slights,
you
attacks,
he isn't
and deaths
in the
going
mood
back
for a
generations.
TED Talk.
Children learned their
Down
family's
the
enemies
hill,
alongside their prayers,
a group
memorizing
of children
genealogies of hatred.
practice
Travel
throwing
required careful
small
planning to avoid
axes at
territories where
tree
blood enemies
stumps.
might attack. Even
One
seemingly
misses
peaceful gatherings like this wedding
entirely,
carried
and
undercurrents of
the
potential
axe
violence.
spins
Old
into
feuds
the
that might
dirt.
explode given
The
sufficient
other
ale and proximity.
children laugh
The
not
psychological toll
kindly.
was immeasurable.
The boy
Imagine living your
looks at
entire
them,
life knowing that
cheeks
someone, somewhere,
flushed,
considers your
breath
death a sacred
quickening.
obligation.
Then
Every
he
stranger might be a
retrieves
distant
the
cousin of
axe
someone your
and
grandfather
tries
killed.
again.
Every invitation might be a
Jaw
trap.
clenched.
Every friendship might be
Even
strategic
at
positioning
10
for
years
future
old,
betrayal.
he
The
knows
paranoia was not irrational,
failure
but
is
entirely
a
justified.
stain.
The sagas are full of men murdered at
Viking
feasts during
child
games,
learns
while sleeping in
early.
supposedly safe
You
halls.
must earn your
Some men tried to
place.
escape the feud cycle by
Earn
leaving entirely.
respect.
Iceland was
Earn
partly settled by
survival.
Norwegians fleeing blood
You
feuds
walk
that had become
toward
unsustainable.
the training
But geography
clearing
provided limited
where
protection.
grown
The same
warriors
ships that carried
practice
settlers
real
also carried
combat.
memory, and
The
feuds thought
sound
buried
of
in Norway
steel
sprouted anew in
cuts
Icelandic
the
soil.
air in
The
sharp
sagas describe
bursts.
killers travelling from Norway
Blade
to
against
Iceland to pursue
shield.
decades-old vengeance,
Blade against
crossing the North
blade.
Atlantic to settle scores that
Sweat
originated before the voyage was
glistens on
technically possible.
foreheads,
The
turning
morning
to
after the wedding
steam
brings
in
news that shifts the
cold
entire
air.
dynamic of Bjorn's promised vengeance.
Warriors grunt,
The Thing Assembly has
shout,
convened an emergency
slam
session,
each
and
other
their judgment is
down.
swift. Bjorn is declared an
Even
outlaw,
practice carries
not for
risk.
making his oath of vengeance, that was
A
perfectly legal,
misstep could
but for an
mean
older crime that his
broken
enemies have
bones
strategically
or
brought forward.
worse.
Apparently,
But
3 months ago,
nobody
Bjorn killed a
reacts
man's
with
sheep during a
fear.
drunken rampage and never
Pain
paid
is
compensation.
expected.
A petty crime, but
Blood
sufficient grounds
is
for the ultimate
common.
sanction in Viking society.
Fear is
complete
something
legal
you
death.
swallow, not
You
something
watch Bjorn
you
receive the
show.
news in the marketplace.
One
The law speaker,
warrior
a man whose
kneels
prodigious memory
beside a
contains the entire legal
trainee,
code,
guiding
recites the formula
younger
that strips
man's
away
grip
everything that
on
makes a
the
person
hilt.
human under law.
Keep your
Bjorn is
shield
now a
up,
Tlagi, literally
always.
outside the law.
If you
He has
die
3 days
with
to
your
leave the district.
shield down,
After that,
men
anyone
will
can kill him
speak
without
of it.
consequence.
The
More than that,
trainee nods
anyone can torture him,
feverishly,
rob him, rape him,
adjusting
enslave
his
him,
stance.
do anything imaginable to his body,
Even death
and the law
is
will treat it
graded
as meaningless
here
as
to
stepping on an ant.
death.
The transformation is
Shameful
immediate
death.
and terrible.
Death's
People Bjorn
worth
has known his
singing
entire life
about.
turn away from him.
Death's
Merchants refuse
worth
his silver.
forgetting.
Trading with an outlaw
As
is
you
itself
edge
illegal.
past
The woman he was
practice
courting spits
ring,
at his feet and walks
another
away. His
conversation
own cousins avoid eye contact,
catches your
calculating
ear.
whether family loyalty is
Two
worth the risk of
older men
association.
sit on
In the
a
span of a
log,
morning, Bjorn has gone from a
sharpening
freeman
their
with rights and
axes.
status to something less
They're
than the lowest thrall.
discussing feud
At least
law
thralls have
with
legal existence.
unsettling
Outlaws have nothing.
simplicity.
The concept of outlawry
If
was
he
fundamental to Viking
refuses to
justice,
duel,
a form of social
one
execution that could be
murmurs,
worse than physical
then
death.
outlawry
Full outlawry,
is the
skoganger or
next
forest
step.
going, meant complete
Outlawry.
expulsion from human society.
The word sinks into
The outlaw could not
you
remain
like
in any
a
settled
cold
area,
stone.
could not receive food or shelter
It
from
means
anyone, could not
banishment.
participate in any social,
It
economic or
means
religious
losing
activity.
protection.
They were
It
literally
means
pushed into the
anyone
wilderness,
can kill
forced to
you
survive in
without
forests and mountains like the
consequence.
wild animals they had
Worse
legally become.
than death.
Lesser
Some
outlawry,
say,
Fjörbaugsgada or
instead
life-ring
of
enclosure,
dying once,
offered slightly more hope.
you
The
die
condemned had to leave
socially,
Norway for 3 years, but could attempt to arrange
economically,
passage abroad. They could take property with them if they could manage
every
it.
day
After 3 years, they could
thereafter.
return and attempt to rebuild their
Even
lives.
more men
But even this lesser
gather
sentence meant
near a
separation from
wooden
everything
bench
familiar,
where the
and many
local
lesser
law
outlaws died in
speaker
exile, unable to
stands,
survive without community support.
reciting
The reasons for
precedents
outlawry
for
range from
recent
serious to seemingly
disputes
trivial.
in a steady,
Murder without proper justification, of course.
chant.
Persistent theft,
His voice
sacrilege against the gods
rises
or
and
violation of
falls
temple
like
peace.
waves
But also
against stone.
excessive poetry, mocking
These
important
rules
people,
aren't
seduction of
written.
women under another man's
They live
protection,
in
failure to pay
memory.
debts, or simply
That
accumulating
means
enough
the
enemies that they can
delivery
orchestrate your
isn't
legal
just
destruction through
legal.
technicalities.
It's ceremonial.
The Thing Assembly that declared outlawry might be influenced by
Reputation and
bribes,
honor
political
depend on
pressure,
the
or personal
community
vendettas dressed in
knowing its
legal
own
language.
stories of
You follow Bjorn as he
justice.
attempts to prepare for
You
exile,
step aside
watching the
as a
practical
small
implications of outlawry
procession
unfold.
passes
His
to
family's
men
farm,
carrying
he cannot
a
inherit it
bound
now.
goat,
Outlaws cannot own
a
property.
third carrying
silver he
a
has saved,
carved wooden
worthless if no one will
pole
trade with him,
adorned
the weapons he
with
needs for
cloth.
survival.
Another
His neighbours are already
ritual.
eyeing them, knowing that
Another
once the
moment
3-day grace
where
period
honor
ends, anything
is
Bjorn possesses
intertwined
becomes
with
free plunder.
action.
Some outlaws accepted their
Religious
fate and
rites
disappeared into the
are
wilderness
less
immediately.
about private
Iceland's
piety
interior, Norway's
and
forests,
more
the
about
vast
public
uninhabited spaces of
performance.
Scandinavia swallowed them.
You must be
They lived as
seen
bandits, raiders,
participating.
hermits, ghosts haunting the edges of civilization.
The
sagas romanticize some of these outlaws. Greta the Strong survived 19 years as an outlaw, becoming a legendary figure. But for every Greta, hundreds died unnamed in their first winter, frozen or starved or killed by other outlaws competing for scarce resources. The smart outlaws ran for the ports, seeking passage to lands where their legal status meant nothing. Iceland, before it developed its own legal system, was founded partially by Norwegian outlaws. The Faroe Islands, Orkney, Shetland, and Scottish Hebrides all received waves of outlawed Vikings seeking new lives. Some joined the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, others became raiders in Ireland or traders in Ruslands. Outlawry paradoxically helped spread Viking influence across the known world, but leaving required resources and connections that many outlaws lacked. Ship captains demanded payment up front, no credit for the legally dead. The journey itself was dangerous. Other passengers might decide to claim bounty by killing an outlaw mid-voyage. Even reaching a port during the grace period could be impossible if your enemies blocked the roads. Many outlaws found themselves trapped, watching their 3 days tick away while every escape route closed. The religious implications of outlawry added another layer of horror. Outlaws were barred from religious ceremonies, unable to participate in blot or make offerings to the gods. In a society where divine favor determined everything from weather to warfare, this spiritual exile was devastating. Some believed outlaws were cursed, that associating with them invited divine punishment. This supernatural fear reinforced the social isolation, making even brief assistance to an outlaw feel dangerously transgressive. Women could be declared outlaws too, though it was rarer. The sagas record women outlawed for witchcraft, for particularly egregious adultery, for murdering their husbands. Female outlaws faced additional dangers. The sexual violence that threatened all outlaws was essentially guaranteed for women without legal protection. Some female outlaws disguised themselves as men, a capital crime itself, but preferable to the alternatives. Others attached themselves to male outlaws for protection, forming desperate partnerships in the wilderness. The enforcement of outlawry created its own economy. Professional outlaw hunters tracked fugitives for bounties. These men were skilled woodsmen, trackers who could follow a trail through wilderness for weeks. They knew the hiding spots, cave systems, the remote valleys where outlaws attempted to survive. Some hunters were former outlaws themselves, their sentences commuted in exchange for hunting their former peers. The moral complexity of using outlaws to catch outlaws apparently troubled no one. Bjorn makes a desperate decision. Rather than flee, he will appeal to Grimmer, the man he swore to kill, for assistance. The irony is sharp enough to cut, but Grimmer is wealthy enough to pay the compensation for the sheep, wealthy enough to bribe the Thing Assembly to reconsider. You watch Bjorn approach Grimmer's farm as the second day of his grace period ends. The humiliation on his face is absolute. He is begging his father's killer for salvation. Grimmer receives him with calculated coldness. Yes, he could pay the compensation. Yes, he has influence with the law speaker. But what price for this assistance? Bjorn must publicly renounce his vengeance oath. He must swear friendship with Grimmer's family. He must accept his father's death as legally concluded. And, here Grimmer smiles, he must serve as Grimmer's man for 3 years, essentially voluntary thraldom to avoid involuntary outlawry. The negotiation is excruciating to witness. Bjorn knows this is his only chance. His mother and siblings have already made clear they cannot help. Associating too closely with an outlaw-to-be might drag them into legal jeopardy. His father's brothers have their own families to protect. Grimmer's offer, humiliating as it is, represents survival. The alternative is the forest, the wilderness, the slow death of exposure, or the quick death of another outlaw's blade. Bjorn accepts. The Thing reconvenes. Grimmer pays the compensation and speaks on Bjorn's behalf, transforming from enemy to savior in a performance that everyone recognizes as pure power politics. The outlawry is rescinded. Bjorn's legal existence is restored. But everyone understands what really happened. Grimmer has won
It's a
completely, turning his
demand,
enemy's son into a
a
servant,
mandate,
transforming vengeance
a
into submission.
constant trial
You
without
realize this is how the
judge
outlawry system
or
truly
end.
functioned. Not
And
just as
to
punishment,
live
but as
here
leverage.
truly,
The threat of
live
outlawry
here
could force
you
behavior that no
must
other pressure could
accept
achieve.
one
Debts were
truth
paid,
that would
disputes settled,
terrify
vengeance
most
abandoned, all
modern
because the alternative was
minds.
legal death.
Honor
Those with
is
power
worth
wielded outlawry like a
dying
weapon,
for,
while those
and
without it lived in constant
sometimes
fear of its deployment
worth
against them.
killing for.
In the weeks that follow Bjorn's very public humiliation, you begin to notice something else about Viking justice. Outlawry is the nuclear option, yes, but between the normal fines and full legal death, there sits an entire toolbox of punishments that are equal parts creative, terrifying, and frankly a little too theatrical. You get your first front row seat to this side of Viking law on an otherwise ordinary afternoon near the Thing site. A crowd is forming around a central post by the assembly field, and the buzz in the air has that specific tone that says, "We're about to watch something awful, and no one is going to look away." At the centre, tied to the post, stands a man in his 30s, wrists bound, hair matted with dried blood. His nose is already crooked, clearly broken in a recent fight, and his eyes flick nervously from face to face. Around him, elders from the local families sit on stones and benches, acting as judges and witnesses. The law speaker steps forward, staff in hand, and recites this man's crimes in a chanting, almost bored cadence. The list is long: theft, repeated fights at feasts, sexual assault of a thrall woman, attempted rape of a free woman, refusal to pay previous fines. In a word, he's finally annoyed enough people that the community has decided to make an example of him. Today is not about getting compensation, it's about sending a message. The sentence is announced: partial mutilation, permanent marking and public shaming, specifically nostril slitting and ear cropping. The man gasps, actually tries to laugh it off. It sounds more like a sob. Around you, people nod, some grim, some disturbingly eager to watch. This wasn't random cruelty. This is a known penalty written into law collections across the Norse world. In societies where almost no one can read or write, the body becomes the record. Your crimes get carved into your face. You watch as two strong men hold the criminal's head still. A third steps forward with a long, sharp knife honed to a terrifying thinness. There is no blindfold. Blinding would be another possible punishment, but that's not today's show. Instead, the executioner hooks the knife through one nostril, then the other, and in a single decisive slice, opens them both. Blood pours down over the man's lips and beard. He screams, high, animal, desperate. But the crowd shifts only slightly. Children stand on tiptoe to see better. In Viking legal thinking, this isn't mere sadism. A slit nose is a walking warning label. From this day forward, everyone who sees him will know this man is violent, dishonourable, sexually dangerous. Free women will avoid him. Men will watch him more closely at feasts. If he shows up at a new settlement, he doesn't get to reinvent himself. His face has already introduced him. Next, the ears. Cropping, cutting off the upper portions, was another common penalty, particularly for repeat offenders and thieves who avoided harsher sentences like outlawry. Again, there's a logic here. You don't kill him. You don't even remove his ability to work. But you take pieces of him that don't grow back. The knife flashes, the man struggles against his bonds, and in seconds 2 bloody shapes hit the dirt. The executioner kicks them aside like scraps from a butchered animal. The crowd murmurs, satisfied in a grim way. The law speaker pronounces the shamed man legally alive but socially marked, his status forever downgraded. He will heal, mostly. He'll breathe, work, even marry if someone's desperate enough, but he will never again pass as an ordinary free man. His very face now enforces the judgment of the community every time he steps into public. As you walk away from the Thing field, people casually swap stories of other punishments they've seen. A one-eyed man who'd assaulted a chieftain's daughter, a limping woman whose heel tendon had been sliced as retribution for arson. You realise that, to Vikings, punishment wasn't only about rebalancing justice, it was about theatre. pain as public education, and yes, sometimes it tipped into pure cruelty. Down by the shore, you hear older men reminiscing about a punishment that makes even some Vikings frown: drowning in bogs and marshes. It was used especially for certain crimes considered polluting: infanticide beyond the legal exposure window, witchcraft, and occasionally women guilty of adultery who had offended very powerful men. Unlike hanging or beheading, drowning was slow, cold, and deliberately isolating. The condemned would be taken out to a marsh or peat bog, their hands bound, sometimes with weights attached, and forced into the sucking mud. The community might watch from solid ground as the victim struggled, sank, resurfaced, screamed, and finally disappeared under the dark surface. Sometimes a pole was used to push them down if they tried to crawl back towards safety. Bog bodies found in northern Europe, throats cut, limbs bound, sometimes with evidence of blows to the head and strangulation, suggest just how ritualized this could be. Even in law, drowning was sometimes specified as particularly appropriate when a person's crime was seen as contaminating the community. Let the earth and water take them. Let their body disappear where no marker, no grave, no memory remains. Then there's castration. Not common, but feared enough that the mere threat could bend a man's will like green wood. Sexual crimes, especially those against high-status women or boys, could theoretically earn this penalty. The sagas and later law codes mention men who were gelded as punishment, robbed permanently of their ability to reproduce, their masculinity literally cut away. You catch part of a conversation between two women near a weaving shed. They're discussing a notorious case from a neighbouring district, a man who forced himself on a jarl's young son. The penalty, they say, was to make him like a thrall woman. No weapons, no rights, and no manhood. The older woman comments dryly that it was still too kind. Public humiliation accompanied many of these punishments. The condemned might be forced to walk through the settlement while people shouted insults, pelted them with filth, or beat them with branches. The thief might have stolen goods tied around his neck as he was marched around, one long, miserable advertisement of his crime. Being labelled Needinger, a despicable, honourless person, could be almost as devastating as physical mutilation. A Needinger could find himself effectively unemployable, unmarriageable, maybe even killed with impunity if he pushed things too far. The underlying idea tying all these penalties together is stark. Your body belongs to the community as much as to you. You harm the social order gets to carve its judgment into your skin. You spend a day listening to legal stories. People here treat them the way modern folks treat true crime podcasts. They retell famous punishments like chilling campfire tales, a man who repeatedly lied under oath, his tongue pierced, or in some versions, partially removed, a woman accused of poisoning her husband, paraded naked through the settlement before being stoned outside the boundaries, a chronic fire setter, his fingers smashed one by one then banished. Sometimes punishment and performance blur so much you can hardly see a line. One farmer gleefully describes how, in his youth, a convicted arsonist was forced to rebuild the burned house with his own labour, while chained at the ankle, fed just enough to work. Once the house was rebuilt, the farmer adds, the man was driven off anyway. You don't sleep peacefully in a bed built by a fire starter, he says, and nobody laughs because that's not a joke here. Torture as sustained practice wasn't as systematised as in later medieval Europe, but short, intense suffering used to extract confessions or names of accomplices absolutely existed. A thief might be questioned with hot irons or by tightening cords around fingers and limbs until bones creaked. The belief was simple. If you're innocent, the gods will protect you. If you're guilty, the pain is just your debt coming due early. What really twists the knife, though, is how normalised all of this is. You watch a group of children reenacting a punishment scene with carved wooden figures. One kid gleefully announces, "Now we cut off his ears!" The others shriek with delighted horror. To them, this is just part of how the world works, like weather or winter or whales beaching. And while all this is happening, life continues. A woman with neatly slit nostrils, punishment from decades ago bargains fiercely over fish prices like nothing is wrong. A man with one eye, blinded years earlier for attacking a priest, patiently teaches a boy how to sharpen an axe. People step around them, talk to them, trade with them. The scars are conversation starters sometimes, fodder for gossip, but not barriers to existence. "He paid," someone says with a shrug. "The matter is ended." In a way, that's the heart of Viking punishment. Pay your due, whether in silver, blood, or bits of flesh, and society moves on. There is no prison where you sit for years, invisible and forgotten. Your sentence lives on your body and everyone is your warden. You start to understand how profoundly different their sense of normal is. For you, physical safety feels like a baseline right. For them, it's negotiable, conditional, up for discussion at the thing. And if you think this is as far as Viking violence toward the body goes, you haven't yet seen what they do for death. Or, more precisely, for the dead they really care about. Because across the fjord, preparations are beginning for the funeral of a local chieftain. And unlike the petty criminal whose nose was open to teach a lesson, this man's death will demand something else entirely, not mutilation, but company. For him to travel properly to the next world, someone living will have to go along, voluntarily or not. Word of the chieftain's death spreads through the settlement like smoke on a windless day, slow at first, then everywhere. He was not a king, not some saga hero with 100 raids to his name, but he was important enough, a land-rich man in his late 50s, 3 sons, 2 daughters, 2 wives dead before him, and a household full of thralls and freedmen who depended on his favour. When you arrive at his longhouse, the transformation is already underway. The building that days ago echoed with feasts and arguments has become half home, half shrine. A heavy stillness presses on everything. Men speak in low tones. Women move with practiced efficiency. Death here is not an interruption. It's a process everyone knows by heart. His body lies on a raised bed, cleaned and dressed in his finest clothing. A rich wool tunic embroidered with rune-like designs at the cuffs, cloak pinned with a shining brooch of silver. At his waist his sword, an heirloom with a pattern-welded blade that glimmers in the firelight. One of his sons adjusts the dead man's hand so it rests on the sword's hilt, fingers curled like he's about to draw it. This, you're told quietly, is only the beginning. The real journey hasn't started yet. Around the hall, people are laying out grave goods. A shield, spears, a decorated helmet, tools, a gaming board with carved pieces, a drinking horn, a chest of clothes. Outside, thralls prepare horses, 2 of them, shiny-coated and restless, their fate as sealed as their owners. And then there's her. Near the back fire, seated on a low stool, is a young thrall woman, perhaps in her early 20s. Unlike the other female slaves moving briskly through the hall, this one is strangely still. Her wrists are bound, but loosely. Her face is composed, not struggling, not wailing. It's the expression of someone who has already accepted a decision no one bothered to ask her to make. You don't need anyone to tell you what she is. You've seen enough by now to recognize the pattern. She is going with him. Funeral sacrifice for elite men was not, as some modern stories pretend, a daily occurrence. It was rare, reserved for those of high rank and exceptional wealth. But when it happened, it followed an awful, chilling script. You hear whispers of a famous account from the east, of a Rus chieftain, a Scandinavian ruling among Slavs along the Russian rivers, whose death was recorded by an Arab traveller. In that telling, a slave girl volunteers, after some coaxing and threats, to die with her master. She's dressed like a bride, paraded, fed, intoxicated, and then, in a sequence that blurs religious ritual and sexual assault, she's killed atop her master's boat before the whole thing is set on fire. Here in this hall, the tone is quieter, but the logic is the same. A great man needs a proper entourage in the next world, just as he needed one in this one. Horses to ride, weapons to wield, tools to use, and people to serve him. You watch the chieftain's widow, his 3rd wife and still alive, move through the preparations like a commander managing a campaign. She gives orders about the food for the feast, the burial mound to be raised, the valuables to be included in the grave. When she reaches the bound thrall woman, she pauses, lays a hand briefly on her shoulder. It's not affection so much as acknowledgement. The kind of look you might give someone who has stepped into the path of an avalanche you both know isn't stopping. The decision of who dies with a chieftain varies by time and place. Sometimes it's chosen from among thralls, sometimes taken from foreign slaves captured in raids. Very occasionally a free companion or concubine volunteers, seeing the sacrifice as the highest form of loyalty and a guaranteed ticket to honour in the next world. But the sagas and accounts are blunt. Volunteering often comes with pressure so heavy it barely deserves the word. The young thrall woman is washed and dressed in fine linen she never wore in life. Her hair is combed and braided. Women anoint her with scented oils. The whole process looks disturbingly like preparing a bride on her wedding day. In a way, that's exactly what this is. A wedding of death. A final binding to a man who never asked for her heart, only her labour and her body. Outside, men work to prepare the burial site. Unlike the famous dramatic ship burials where an entire vessel is interred, this chieftain will receive a boat-shaped stone outline on land, with planks and a section of an old ship set into the ground. The grave is deep and wide enough to hold a man, his weapons, his animals, and at least one living human. You're close enough to see the grave once it's prepared, the bottom layered with textiles and furs like a luxurious bed, weapons placed along one side, tools and chests arranged near the head. At the far end, a space remains clear. Everyone knows what or who will occupy it. Before the actual burial comes the funeral feast. As with almost everything in Viking culture, food and drink accompany even the worst horrors. You sit in the hall as roasted meat is passed around. Ale pours like water, and men take turns standing to boast of the dead chieftain's deeds. They speak of raids down the English coast, of ships he led through storms, of enemies he killed, of silver hoards he amassed. Each speech ends with a raised horn and a shouted farewell, voices cracking with something between grief and admiration. The thrall woman sits through this too. At one point she's given a drink, a strong mixture of ale and something stronger, possibly to calm her, possibly to dull what's coming, possibly to ensure she doesn't try to run when the ritual begins. Finally, as twilight bleeds into night, the hall empties. Torches are carried out. The chieftain's body is lifted on a bier and borne to the grave, accompanied by chanting and occasional wails. The horses are led after him, snorting nervously, their eyes rolling. And behind the animals, walking on numb legs, comes the thrall. The killing of animals is swift. One horse is dispatched with a single axe blow to the skull, the other with a cut to the throat that spills its life in a hot river over the grave edge. Their bodies are dragged into the pit, arranged near their dead master's feet. Blood seeps into the soil, darkening it, consecrating it in the eyes of those watching. Then all attention turns to the living woman. Some societies strangled sacrificial victims, quick and impersonal. Others stabbed them. The Ross account mentions multiple men entering the tent with the girl, violating her, while an older woman, something like a ritual priestess, guides the process. Then a rope is twisted around the victim's neck and pulled while she is also stabbed. Layers of death, layered meanings. Here, the method is simpler, but no less brutal. Two men take her by the arms and lead her down into the grave. She stumbles once on the earthen steps, steadies herself, keeps walking. People say she has been promised a high place in the next life, that she will sit on cushions, drink the best ale, be waited on as she once waited on others. It's amazing what people are told when someone needs them to die quietly. At the bottom, she is positioned beside the dead chieftain, her body arranged as if reclining. An older woman, the local Völva, a seer and ritual specialist, speaks words over them both. She calls to the gods, to the ancestors, to the land spirits. It's half prayer, half incantation, its meaning mostly lost under the roaring in your ears. Then, without ceremony, a man steps down into the grave behind her, loops a cord around her neck, and pulls. The struggle is ugly, short, and very real. Her hands claw at the rope, her feet kick in the loose dirt, the man's arms strain. Another man joins in, adding his weight. You see her eyes bulge, her face darken, then slacken. When her body stops moving, they hold the rope a few moments longer just to be sure, and then she's just placed, another object in the grave, arranged so that from above it looks like a peaceful tableau. Master, servant, horses, weapons, all set for the long journey beneath the earth. The onlookers are sombre but not horrified. Some even look satisfied. A proper man has been given a proper send-off. His status in the next world is secured by the lives buried with him. The thrall woman had nothing before. Now she has a story sung over her, a place in someone's saga, even if only as a line, and a girl was sacrificed with him. Not all Viking burials were this extreme. Many free farmers were buried alone, with modest grave goods, tools, weapons, a few ornaments. In some regions and later periods, cremation dominated. Bodies burned on pyres with their belongings, the ashes collected or scattered. But for the elite, the temptation to stage their own eternity in material form proved hard to resist. Ship burials are the most dramatic example. You've heard of them. Full ships drawn onto land, placed into prepared pits, loaded with goods, animals, and sometimes human sacrifices, then buried under mounds that still scar the Scandinavian landscape. The famous Oseberg and Gokstad ships in Norway held women of very high status, along with sledges, carriages, animals, textiles, and an astonishing array of objects. Some bones in these graves bear cut marks suggesting ritual slaughter. Even in less spectacular graves, the belief is clear. Death is not an end, but a relocation. The deceased will need in the next world what they needed here. Status markers, tools, companions. The line between grave ritual and human rights violation simply didn't exist in their worldview. You walk away from the closing grave as men shovel earth, women toss in sprigs of herbs, and a cairn begins to rise. Behind you, the longhouse begins to reorganize around a new power structure. A widow, ambitious sons, nervous thralls. In front of you lies the larger Viking world, where what you've just seen is shocking but not unthinkable. Because this is the part that twists your brain the most. The same people who can watch a woman strangled into a grave for their leader will tomorrow spend an entire morning washing their hair, trimming their beards, and making sure every single one of their filed teeth looks just right. They will step from blood-drenched sacrifice rituals straight into meticulous grooming sessions that would impress a modern influencer. And if you meet a Viking up close in broad daylight, you might be far more startled by how clean and styled he is than by the axe at his hip. You wake the next morning half expecting to see more death, more blood, more legal brutality. Instead, you walk down to the riverbank and nearly laugh out loud. The edge of the water looks less like a camp of legendary raiders, and more like the world's coldest outdoor beauty salon. Men, and a few women, sit on flat stones or crouch along the bank, each with a small kit of tools laid out neatly beside them. Combs, tweezers, ear spoons, little knife-like scrapers. One guy is holding up a polished metal disc, checking his reflection, and angling his head to see if his beard looks even. Another is working methodically at his friend's hair, braiding it with frankly impressive focus. A third man leans close over the water, carefully plucking his eyebrows. So much for the stereotype of unkempt savages. If you dropped a modern Scandinavian here with a ring light and some hair product, they'd blend right in. A wiry man with blonde hair so pale it's almost white notices your expression and grins. "Thought we'd be filthy," he asks in a rough mix of languages you manage to follow. That's what monks always say. Filthy heathens. Then they see our combs and look like someone stole their god. He holds up his comb. It's carved from bone, fine-toothed, beautiful enough you'd expect to see it in a museum. In fact, you will see it in a museum 1,000 years from now, because archaeologists will dig up thousands just like it from Viking graves and house sites. If there's a single object that sums up just how seriously Vikings took personal grooming, it's this. Everyone seems to have one. Men, women, even thralls. You realise something that would have surprised a lot of terrified monks. Compared to many medieval Europeans, Vikings were fastidious. They washed at least once a week, usually on the day we still call by their name, Lördagsdag, washing day, the origin of our word Saturday in some northern languages. But many rinsed their faces and hands every morning. They combed their hair daily, detangled beards, checked for lice with the same vigilance you use on your phone battery percentage. And the tools aren't just practical, they're stylish. You see comb cases hanging from belts, tiny tweezers, ear picks, nail cleaners, little grooming kits that function like status symbols. The law codes even list fines for stealing someone's comb. Imagine that court scene. He took my beard comb. I demand compensation. A nearby woman is busy bleaching her hair. She's kneeling with a wooden bowl in front of her, vigorously working a white, pasty mixture through her dark blonde strands. The smell hits you a second later. Sharp, acrid, like an unholy alliance of cleaning product and barnyard. She sees your face and laughs. Lie, she explains, tapping the bowl. From ashen water, burns a bit, but it makes the hair light. You like? You look around and realise how many unnaturally light heads you see. Not everybody here is a natural tow-headed Norse god. Many have chemically assisted brightness. Light hair was valued. It hinted at youth, beauty, and in some regions, even divine favour. So they improvised early hair bleach from wood ash and water, high in caustic lye. It cleaned, sure. It also stripped colour and in generous doses stripped a few layers of scalp. Sometimes burns too much, the woman admits cheerfully, rubbing at a faint red patch on her temple. But better yellow than dull. Priorities. She gestures toward a man a few steps away. See his beard? He uses it too. His beard is several shades lighter than his eyebrows, which makes for a slightly comedic effect. Nobody here seems to mind. You've seen worse at modern barbers. And then someone smiles at you fully and you notice something much stranger than hair bleach. His teeth. Not the shape. They're mostly straight and surprisingly intact. It's what's carved into them. Faint but visible are horizontal grooves across the front of the incisors and canines. Deliberate, coloured slightly darker than the tooth itself. Like someone rubbed pigment into the channels. You look closer at a few more smiles. Same thing, lines filed into the enamel, neat and even. You are staring at Viking dental bling. Archaeologists will later find Viking skulls with these exact modifications, mostly from male warriors in Sweden and Denmark. Fine grooves filed across the front teeth, likely filled with pigment, resin, or even metal dust. The effect in life? When you grin or snarl in battle, your teeth look wrong, marked, inhuman, terrifying. You gesture to one of the men. Why? You ask, pointing to his mouth. He bares his teeth proudly. So they know, he says. Know what? That I'm not a farmer, he replies, not a thrall, not a man to insult. So, brand, flex, and weaponized intimidation, all in one. Getting it done would have been unpleasant. No anaesthetic, just someone with a lot of time, a sharp tool, and your absolute trust, or at least your inability to run away fast enough. You wince inwardly at the thought of enamel being scratched away slowly, nerve endings vibrating with each scrape. But for these warriors, pain is just another currency. You pay in agony now, reap respect, or fear later. Further up the bank, a bearded man sits with his legs stretched out while his wife trims his moustache with the concentration of a surgeon. Long drooping moustaches could interfere with eating or drinking, so designs varied by function and fashion. Some men sport neatly trimmed goatees, others full, plaited beards, often tied with little bronze or bone beads. Braided beards don't just look imposing, they also keep facial hair out of soup and sword blades. One teenager stands before an older man who's clearly a local trendsetter. The elder is carefully parting the boy's hair down the centre, shaving the lower back and sides close with a narrow blade while leaving a long top that can be tied, braided, or left to fall dramatically. It's basically an early undercut. You half expect someone to invent hair gel next out of whale fat and pine resin. Nearby, a group of men argue intensely, about beard lengths and what they say about character. Long beards, wise but possibly impractical. Short beards, either young, vain, or secretly church-leaning, depending on who you ask. One insists that a true warrior's beard should show just enough grey to signal experience, but not so much that people start asking if you need help up the stairs. Women, too, are deep into their own grooming rituals. They wash their hair with the same harsh lye soap, but often counter it with animal fat or oils to restore some softness. Braids of astonishing complexity spiral around their heads, pinned with bone or metal needles. You realise these styles are not decorative fluff. They're time-intensive, collaborative, and absolutely modern in their sense of this is part of who I am. One girl, maybe 16, holds up a polished bronze mirror as her friend traces subtle lines of dark pigment around her eyes with a charred stick dipped in fat. Viking women used forms of eye makeup, soot, crushed minerals, natural dyes, to darken lashes and brows, enhance contrast, and probably, let's be honest, look terrifyingly good stabbing people with glances across firelit halls. You remember that in the monasteries and courts of Christian Europe, there were complaints. Clerics grumbled about these Northmen who bathed too often, combed their hair, trimmed their beards, changed shirts regularly, and thus seduced local women with their scandalous cleanliness. Medieval chroniclers do not usually admit defeat, but some of their comments boil down to, "Our men do not stand a chance against these annoyingly well-groomed pagans." Hygiene and style, in other words, were not side notes in Viking life. They were strategies, social weapons almost as sharp as their axes. You also start to see that grooming isn't just vanity, it's social glue. A boy sits between his father's knees while the older man patiently combs his hair, checking for lice, murmuring advice about raids, farming, and how not to get yourself outlawed. Friends groom each other's hair and beards, picking at tangles, laughing at cowlicks. Women gather in clusters to braid and rebraid styles, trading gossip, recipes, and curse formulas along with hairpins. These quiet, ordinary moments of touch and care sit right beside the horrors you've seen. Slave markets, sacrifice pits, dual islands, grave stranglings. The contradiction is jarring. How can the same man who tenderly picks nits from his child's hair also think nothing of owning another human being? How can the woman who just wept at a funeral sit down minutes later to carefully draw pigment along her friend's eyelids? But that's exactly the world you're in. Brutality and tenderness don't cancel each other out here. They coexist. Clean fingernails and bloodied hands belong to the same people. Later that afternoon, you wander back through the settlement and notice a line of freshly washed shirts flapping in the wind, bleached linen bright against the grey sky. A woman stands nearby with a tub of water so cloudy it looks like it's contemplating rebellion. She wrings another tunic, muscles straining, then laughs with her neighbour about whose husband complains more when lye soap stings his skin. "Tell him to roll in the muck with the pigs then," she snorts. "If he wants to smell like one, may as well commit." The neighbour snickers. "Better a husband who stinks of lye than one who stinks of other women," she replies, and both dissolve into laughter. You pass a group of warriors lounging in the sun, weapons laid aside, each absently fingering beard beads, adjusting hair braids, picking at bits of leather armour. They look like a band shot for some grim Viking metal album, except for the part where one is squinting into a polished shield, tugging frustratedly at a stray patch of beard trying to escape the plait. And then, as evening settles and the day's washing and plucking ends, you feel the story of this place begin to close around you. You've seen the full spectrum, from infants left on icy hillsides to thralls sold like cattle, from goats sacrificed amid chanting to women strangled into graves, from boys driven into duels to men carved by the law, from outlaws turned into walking targets to warriors filing their teeth just to look a little more terrifying, and then spending half a morning braiding their hair. The Vikings were not movie monsters or misunderstood saints. They were people. Dangerous, yes. Shockingly practical. Often cruel, but also deeply human. Vain, ambitious, fearful, affectionate, superstitious, and weirdly obsessed with good hair. And as you stand for one last moment in the cool coastal air, listening to gulls cry over the fjord and the muffled sounds of a longhouse settling into night, low voices, clatter of wooden bowls, a baby fussing, you realise that the real shock isn't any single brutal custom. The real shock is how quickly all of this, slavery, sacrifice, blood feuds, outlawry, mutilation, became normal to them. The same way your world's oddities and cruelties are normal to you. And with that thought, the Viking settlement around you begins to fade. The smell of smoke and lye and salt water thins. The crunch of frost underfoot softens into the quiet of your own room. The past, like a longship returning to harbour, slides back into the dark. You're left holding only echoes, the flash of filed teeth, the glint of a comb, the distant chanting of men who think the gods are listening. And perhaps a little uncomfortable question. If their normal now horrifies you, what will some future sleeper think, listening to a whisper about your time, the cold fjord, the blood-damp earth, the harsh laughter and the sharper steel? All of it drifts away now, like mist lifting from dark water in the first pale light of morning. Let your breathing slow, in and out, the way the tide moves against the shore. Each inhale can carry in a little of that clean sea air, sharp with salt and distant pine. Each exhale can let go of the weight of what you've seen, the slave chains, the dual island, the stifling air of the grave. The longhouse roofs you walked beneath shrink into the distance, their turf and timber blending back into the hillside. The shouts from the market, the clatter of weapons, even the low murmur of gossip at the thing all soften, then fall quiet, as though someone has closed a door between you and that faraway age. You can still, if you choose, picture one Viking at the river's edge, rinsing his comb, bored and ordinary, unaware that 1,000 years later someone would be whispering his morning routine into the dark. But now you can let him go, just another person in the long parade of history, receding down a path you no longer have to follow. Slide your attention away from their stark winters and long nights into your own softer darkness. Feel the safety of your bed beneath you, the familiar texture of your pillow, the warmth that pulls slowly under your blankets. Here, there are no outlaw hunters in the forest, no assembly deciding your fate, no gods demanding blood. Just the gentle, quiet certainty that the only thing asked of you right now is to rest. If any of those images of carved teeth or slit noses or ships buried under mounds still linger at the edges of your mind, imagine them covered in snow layer by layer. The sharp edges blur, the colours fade, the noise stops. Time falls like that snow, steadily, endlessly, until all those old fears are buried deep, deep beneath the smooth, untouched surface. You can leave them there. What you keep instead is the distance, the knowledge that you are here, small and safe in the dim light of your own room, listening to stories from another world that cannot reach you. Let your eyes grow heavier, your thoughts slower, as if each one has to trudge a little farther through soft drifts before it reaches you. When they tire, when they decide to lie down and sleep in that quiet white, you don't have to follow them. You can simply float on the dark fjord with no wind and no oars, the water like glass beneath you, the stars unfamiliar but kind above. No raids waiting, no feasts to attend, no laws to remember, just the endless gentle rocking toward dreams,